Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. As Andy presented me, I'm the ICANN's Vice President for UN Engagement based in New York. ICANN has historically started to engage with the UN since 2014 when I moved to New York and became responsible for this relationship. What we do is follow the discussions at the UN, which might have some impact on ICANN's missions and remit, and also provide educational outreach efforts to the UN and to the permanent missions to the UN by bringing experts from ICANN or from other organizations to talk to the diplomats and to the UN staff to explain how the internet works, what ICANN does, with the goal when they start negotiating behind closed doors different texts that might have some impact on the internet in general, but also on ICANN, to have the knowledge, or if they don't know what is the necessary subject, they could call us and we can find the answer for them. I mean, we're not a lobbying organization. We don't lobby for ICANN. We just really have some good relationship with the UN. Our president and CEO, Joran Marby, has met with the Secretary General, has had participation at a couple of forums at the UN, and we do regular briefings with diplomats. So that's what ICANN does, and that's what I do. Now, what we follow and what I wanted to touch on this subject are the cyber discussions at the UN. Now, we call them cyber discussions, but they're actually not called cyber. Cybersecurity is not a term that is used at the UN. There are several parallel going processes within the UN currently, which we follow. So first is the group of governmental experts, it has been established in the past several times, but this current year, the GGE, head of the group of governmental experts, is working to issue a report by next fall, sorry, not this year fall, but 2021. And we also have the Openended working group, which is supposed to finish its work this year and present a report this fall. There is also another group which was established with again with the previous the current General Assembly rather. It's called the Open-Ended Ad Hoc Intergovernmental Committee of Experts. This is a group which is supposed to meet first time in August this year, and it's supposed to start drafting a new cybercrime convention. These groups are open for member states only. The group of governmental experts consists of 25 experts, which are nominated by different governments following the UN regional diversity, etc. It's chaired by a very distinguished Brazilian diplomat, and it has had a couple of meetings so far but it's doing its job, with the participation only on the governmental experts. So the Open-Ended Working Group, the OEWG, consists of all member states, but it's doing its work also in more public environments. Its sessions are being webcast, and at certain points, it also allowed other stakeholders to address the member states with their concerns. I will be sharing in the chat later a link to one of the papers that the government engagement team has prepared on this matter, and you will be able to see how the work has been of these different groups has been developing until late February this year. And I will only update you that between late February and today, the Open-Ended Working Group of course, is now being in the conditions of everyone else. You know, COVID-19 has hit New York pretty hard. Is having its virtual meeting. Actually, the first virtual meetings will be taking place next week in a period of 3 days of next week, and there will be for the first time such a virtual meeting. So we will. It has published also the chair of this group, which is who is also a very distinguished Swiss diplomat, has published a draft paper, and I will put a link in the chat also to that paper so that you can take a look at it. The previous draft of his report has been commented by dozens of countries and about 20 non-governmental organizations. On the link I will share, you can see all these comments. They are trying to do as much as they can in terms of providing publicity to their work. You will see also that there are actually, and I'm putting the link as we speak. Oops, it's there. There are also recordings from their previous meeting in September and in February. So it's very convenient to take a look if you want to spend some time and find out exactly what they're doing. That is the place to start. And also, as I promised, I'm putting another link in the chat with the government engagement publications. You will see, by the way, that besides the overview of deliberations on cybersecurity and cybercrime, we have 2 more papers on the European Union policy updates and the GDPR 2020 review. What the goal, I mean, our goal from ICANN's point of view is that we are trying to, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to really bring the knowledge that ICANN has and the experts that work with ICANN to the attention of the diplomats. Our regular briefings have been attended between 40 to 116 people. The last one that we did in April was a virtual one, and we had 116 diplomats and also people from foreign ministries from around the globe. We do that because, not because there is no government engagement within ICANN, there is a lot. We have a governmental advisory committee, and the people who are members of this governmental advisory committee are usually from the telecom administration of the countries that participate. We wanted to expand this a little bit because the people who are at the UN are not coming from the telecom administration, they're from the foreign ministries. And these people not necessarily follow ICANN's whereabouts, and they don't necessarily know that much about the way the internet is functioning. So there is a lot of opportunity that we are trying to use, and we are also in a position where, because we are we have presence in New York, it's very easy to get to the UN, talk to people face to face, including through some of their meetings which take place throughout the year. Now with the COVID-19 restrictions, meetings are taking place virtually. So in some ways it's easier, but in some ways it's not so easy because the UN has this way of negotiations which are formal meetings, but then there are informal meetings. And the informal meetings are usually face-to-face, and they're not that easy to take place when people are behind their computers. I will finish here, and I haven't looked at questions, but I wanted to see whether we have managed to get the connectivity back with Timo.
Can I speak straight away, Andy?
Go right ahead, please do.
I hope it works now. I'm very sorry that apparently my laptop has some issues. I'm now on my phone. So Veni has laid out the process quite well for you. What I wanted to do is go a little bit deeper into the substance of both tracks. So we have the open-ended working group where 193 nations participate, at least they're able to participate, and it has a multi-stakeholder setting. So there's some NGOs that are involved, and some industry that try to weigh in. And then the group of governmental experts is only 5 selected nations. The Netherlands is part of that. So that's a less inclusive format. Both roughly talk about the same set of subjects, and there's 6. And I'll go into each one and give you a little bit of a flavor of what's on the menu. First chapter is existing and potential threats. Now, you could say that there's a large amount of agreement between 193 states about what the existing and potential threats are. We understand that it's first state behavior that is malicious. It's states performing malicious acts. It's states hiring proxies. It's also terrorist organizations. It's criminal organizations. And we have, especially on the side of the state actors, which is the subject of this discussion, it's the agreement is pretty clear. Added to that, of course, now is the COVID-19 crisis, which has clearly provided an opportunity for some of the bad guys to abuse the situation for cyber attacks, even on medical infrastructure, etc. But on the whole, you could say that looking at previous UN processes and where we are now, there's a large degree of agreement of what the potential threats are. Now, the funny thing is, although we all agree between 193 states what are the threats and what is permissible and what is not permissible for state actors, of course, cyber attacks are on the rise. So the schizophrenic situation is that you're actually sitting in the room with the bad guys. We are the threat. It's not that there's a separate set of nations that are performing the malicious acts and the people in the room are actually the good guys. No, it's actually all those nations that actually acknowledge that certain threats exist and that we should counter them. They're at the same time the perpetrators of these acts. Second chapter is about international law and the applicability of international law. If you look at where we were in 2015, the previous group of governmental experts, there was a large degree of agreement on applicability of international law. International law, at least my country and a vast group of nations believe that international law, international humanitarian law, the Charter of the United Nations are applicable in full in cyberspace. The difficulty is twofold. One is that we say that it's applicable, we don't know exactly how it is applicable. We're still working on that. So, for example, what is the definition of an armed attack? What is the definition of armed conflict? Do the thresholds that we have for these kind of concepts, do they work the same in cyberspace as they do in the real world? And that's still to be determined. A number of nations do not fully accept that international law applies in cyberspace. For example, the Chinese say that international humanitarian law does not apply in cyberspace. There's a number of nations led, I would say, by Russia and China, who believe that we need a new treaty, a new legal instrument to regulate cyberspace, and that would entail basically a new negotiating process from the start, which would render the current international rules-based order null and void, and that would create a huge vacuum which would probably not be filled for a decade or two before you've got something like this negotiated. So let's say European nations, North America, Australia, New Zealand, a number of Asian states believe that international law is applicable in full. Third chapter is norms, rules, and principles for responsible state behavior. Now, there's a number of sets of norms for state behavior. You found them in earlier UN processes, like the 2015 group of governmental experts. But since then, a number of these rules have been further elaborated. Norms have been spelled out. For example, a very worthwhile report, which was sponsored by the Netherlands, was done November last year by the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, GCSC. I think you can find it under cybersecurity.org. And they have reconfirmed the norms that were already in place, and they've amplified a couple of norms that were especially relevant in this day and age. One is not to attack the public core of the internet. So the internet exists of course, many cables, nodes, different infrastructure, but the core should remain sacrosanct and should not be attacked. For a country like the Netherlands, for example, that's very important. We have something that is called the Amsterdam Exchange. Most transatlantic cables actually come ashore in the Netherlands. So we have a special obligation and a special interest in keeping the public core of the internet safe and secure. Second norm that the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace amplified, and which we have submitted in the UN process, is the protection of election infrastructure. Of course, in 2016 and the years after in the United States, but in a number of other countries, election infrastructure and election processes were seriously under pressure. So we have specified, or we're trying to get that accepted in the UN, that we specify that of that critical infrastructure that we know and that we want to protect, because that's one of the other norms, election infrastructure is of specific importance. In our last submission, last month, we have added one more example to that, which is health infrastructure. Of course, on the back of the corona crisis, the COVID-19 attacks on medical infrastructure, the attempts to steal from medical labs the results of research to develop a vaccine. So we have said, in implementing the overall norm not to attack critical infrastructure, we have to single out medical infrastructure. Why is that important? I give you an example from my own country. In my country, so far, medical infrastructure was not defined as critical infrastructure, which means it's not protected by the National Cybersecurity Center. It has to protect itself by its own cert. We are now, having seen what we have seen over the past months, we have now decided to promote medical infrastructure to the category of national critical infrastructure, so that it's not just the norms that nations would have to follow, it's also a matter of adequate protection. We seem to move into a direction that across the UN community, everyone agrees that these kind of norms will have to be strengthened, elaborated, and upheld. But again, I'm coming back to what I said earlier. It's clear that we're not there yet, even though all parties in the room agree that these are the norms. That doesn't mean that these norms are being observed. So it's very important that we keep pushing. Fourth chapter, confidence building measures. Confidence building measures, of course, are known across the disarmament and arms control world. It's not just a cyber thing. So the set of trust and confidence building measures is actually developed under the OSCE. We believe that transparency, predictability, being clear about what kind of capabilities you have and under what kind of circumstances you would deploy and employ them is very important to create trust in cyberspace. It's something that is actually, I would say, CBMs is low-hanging fruit. It's something that you can follow and do as a nation without, because it basically pertains to your own behavior. and it's something that could help a lot. I believe that part of that, and that's a point we have made under the OEWG, is that restraint, self-restraint is probably the most important CBM. It's not a recognized CBM as such, but it's something that nations can exercise, that even though they would have the capabilities to inflict damage on other parties, restraint and showing restraint under certain circumstances is a very important confidence building measure. Again, a pretty wide agreement across the board between nations that these CBMs should be strengthened and upheld. Fifth chapter is capacity building. I talked about it as a Dutch priority as well. I think the capacity building part is a real winner in this process. There is a widespread acknowledgement that we need to, first of all, close the connectivity gap. Still roughly 40 to 50% of the globe is not connected to the internet, and those who are connected are not properly protected. And those who are protected are probably living, sometimes living in countries that have difficulties that are associated with this, like the protection of human rights online, the way crime is being tackled, which is sometimes compromising the fundamental freedoms of individual citizens. I think there's a large recognition that the one half of the world should help the other half of the world. And I think that we will end up in this process with a UN-led initiative that might create a trust fund, that might create a clearinghouse. We from the Netherlands are very much pushing the role of the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, which was initially a Dutch funded mechanism, cyber capacity building platform, gfce.com. It has now been made independent, and it's thriving, and it's probably the most important cyber capacity platform in the world at this moment. Final chapter is called Regular Institutional Dialogue. Institutional dialogue can be read in many different ways. Of course, the OEWG as such is an institutional dialogue. We talk under the UN umbrella between nations about how we organize internet governance, all the issues that I've just mentioned. But I think there's an important difference in the way we approach it from where I sit compared to some others. First of all, we think it's very important to have institutional dialogue in a multi-stakeholder format. So we have to have civil society involved, we have to have the private sector involved, because the internet is not owned by the state. It's not like the public road where the state decides where the traffic lights are, etc. We need to be involved with all the other stakeholders. Unfortunately, although the OEWG was set up as a multi-stakeholder forum by Russian resolution, Russia and a number of other countries actually want this to be a state-led initiative, and also for the future wants this to be a state-led dialogue. Russia, by the way, has in the meantime, in the third committee in the UN, it's a bit of a technical story, submitted a resolution to start a cybercrime treaty discussion, which is hugely distracting from this, and it makes it, I believe, more difficult to get a useful institutional dialogue off the ground. We are not sure from our side whether we need some new body under the UN that would represent institutional dialogue. The Open-Ended Working Group will now be extended for another year, partly because of COVID, but also partly because there's enough to discuss. We think we could have some sort of dialogue, but we need to know what the terms of reference is before we agree. And it certainly should not be the case that a future institutional dialogue is about a new cyber treaty, because then, like I said, then it looks like we have to start from scratch, and I don't think that's desirable, because we first of all have to bank on, let's say, the achievements and consolidate the rules that we have developed over the past decade. Andy, I think I should stop there and then allow for questions or discussions, but I'm in your hands. We can't hear you, Andy.
I was going to say you're on a perfect roll right now, and you're going very, very well. But Veni, would you like to weigh in? We have about a half a dozen questions so far. So first of all, Veni, if you'd like to at least amplify and round out, but just keep in mind, we've got about 20 some odd minutes left in the hour. Yeah. And we have a half a dozen questions, and I'd like to get to those questions if we could. Yeah.
Well, I see Mike Nelson has asked a question, which for those of you who may be only on the phone and not reading it, says, many of us on the call have spent more than 20 years debating digital policy and trying to stop stupid stuff. And we have prevented some of the worst proposals to limit and control what happens online. But today, there are more misguided ideas than ever before, and some of them are being discussed in the hallways of the UN. What are the worst 2 or 3 proposals you have heard proposed in New York or Geneva? Now, you know, Mike, this is and for the record, you know, Mike and I know each other for probably 25 years or so. There are a lot of ideas which have circulated at the UN, which, if you come from the outside world, you may say, oh, but that's not how the internet works. And that's exactly what we are trying to do. Make sure that when there are proposals, the diplomats who are making them, or the discussions that are taking place, take into consideration the facts about the way the internet works. So I will give you an example without obviously naming any country, but there was a proposal which I witnessed when there was a suggestion actually that one of the UN General Assembly resolutions should have a text to call the ICANN board to change the bylaws of ICANN to introduce veto power over the decisions of the board. I mean, this was made by somebody who had read something about the internet. This was again actually 5-6 years ago, long time ago, and they just needed to be educated what ICANN is. You know, it's a non-profit, it's based in California. This is how the governmental advisory committee works, etc., etc. And once you explain the things, people are reasonable. They're not proposing strange things. But actually, I've also seen a very good proposals around the World Summit on Information Society 10-year review, or the WSIS plus 10 in 2015, when countries from around the world reached out consensus that they will be supporting the WSIS plus 10 outcome document, will be supporting the multi-stakeholder model of the internet governance. And this was very important, I think, for the outcome document itself, but also for the governments to understand better how the internet actually works. I hope that answers your question, Mike. And if you have follow-up questions, I'll be happy to answer it. Then I see, oh, that's probably a question for, not for me. Why? Oh, I lost the question somewhere, but there was something about a new international treaty. Oh yeah, why a new international treaty is a bad idea. Timo, would you want to go ahead with that one?
Yes. Someone asked, could you elaborate on why an a new international treaty is not required? So a number of countries, and actually in the past the entire group of governmental experts in 2015 agreed that international law is applicable in its entirety in cyberspace. In other words, if we have a treaty that covers the entirety of this domain, there's no need to have a new treaty. The gap that you could observe is actually the interpretation of international law in cyberspace. So, for example, and then we go to a very topical issue, cyber-enabled information operations during COVID crisis on national crisis response mechanisms could, under certain circumstances, be a violation of international law. During armed conflicts, cyber operations targeting civilian infrastructure and health infrastructure are prohibited, and they constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. In other words, there is no reason to start negotiating a new treaty if we know that the treaties that we have in place are actually applicable. What happens if you start negotiating a new treaty? First of all, it renders the existing set of rules null and void. And secondly, it will probably take a decade or more, because that's the reality in the United Nations, before you have a new set of rules. So we would like to work hard on establishing, elaborating how certain rules work in cyberspace, because it might be slightly different in the real world, but in general, it applies. I think I saw a second question that was directed at me. Yeah, on the roadmap on digital cooperation of the Secretary General. So the Secretary General has instituted a high-level panel last year that was led by, what's her name, Linda Gates, and that has produced a number of recommendations on how to work on cyber capacity building, how to work on spreading norms, etc., and how to secure trust and security in the digital space. The 8 recommendations that were contained in that high-level panel are now being picked up in a roadmap by the Secretary General, which will be developed for the 75th anniversary of the UN, which will be celebrated at the UN General Assembly in September, October this year. Unfortunately, of course, it will be a different kind of a meeting than we anticipated. But the idea is that we use that momentum to bring certain issues, certain principles, and certain concepts which we now develop and negotiate at the working level, that we bring those to the level of heads of state and government, using the level of heads of state and governments to promote certain issues, to pay attention to certain things that need to be further pursued in the near future, is actually a very good way of creating political momentum. I worked at NATO for about a decade, where we used to have NATO summits at the level of heads of state and government, mostly every other year. And it created a dot on the horizon, and it created a certain political momentum, which would then be utilized to actually push decision-making and push certain ambitions further than you could actually reach at the working level, or even at the level of ministers. Andy, I think I should stop there and hand back to you. Is Andy still there?
I didn't unmute. I apologize.
Okay.
There's actually a few questions left. One is directed to Veni.
Yeah. There are 2 directed to me. I can see them.
Yes.
So the first one is by Wolfgang. Civil society organizations have written to Ambassador Lauber and called for transparency in the forthcoming virtual negotiation in the OEWG live streaming. Will ICANN support this proposal? I haven't seen the proposal, but I also answered in writing to another question about it. So as of now, I don't have information that this virtual consultation will be webcast, or it's not on the UN web TV. So we'll see whether there will be some options for participation. I also don't know what kind of software the UN will be using for this, and whether there are any limits for participation. The letter that the chair of the OEWG has published says, and I quote, "Due to technical constraints, I would kindly ask you to participate with maximum 4 members per delegation." And this is sent to all the member states. So that probably means there may be some limits of participation that they can allow in the software. So again, we'll see
maybe
by the end of, yes.
Maybe I could comment on this as well, because this is a very important point. The OEWG was created by a Russian resolution, and the argument that Russia used was it was a more inclusive concept than the GGE, which was 25 states only behind closed doors. The resolution said that it strived for inclusivity and multi-stakeholderism. Funnily enough, after the process started and a number of civil society organizations and NGOs wanted to be accredited to listen in on even on the live meetings in New York, it was Russia actually who blocked the participation of a number of what we call non-ECOSOC accredited NGOs, which was really a pity, because actually this multi-stakeholder model is incredibly important, like I said before, because we cannot organize and discuss internet governance with states only. It's a very important notion that civil society, the private sector, etc., can weigh in on these discussions. So the Netherlands and a number of other states have been pushing for a wider circle of participants, or at least people that could listen and actually make their opinion known during these negotiations. But it has not been easy, and so far it has not been resolved. So there's only a very small number of ECOSOC accredited NGOs that have been admitted. We think that's a real shame.
There was another question by Ivan Sutherland.
Yes.
In what sense is ICANN activity at UN not lobbying? What is the distinction you're trying to make? I was just making a distinction for the US participants, so that we don't go and we don't lobby for ICANN. We don't tell them something, you have to do something which benefits ICANN or anything along those lines. Well, what I'm trying to say is that our effort mainly is educational, and that's why we do all these workshops, seminars, now webinars, and we try to engage with them in ways to explain how the internet works. Not only what ICANN does, but we've participated in a number of events that have been organized by others, not necessarily by ICANN, other UN agencies, I mean, like UNESCO and the UN itself. And that's the whole idea. We need more people with more knowledge. And actually now is the time to say that there is also a program which the Internet Society is running, where they bring diplomats to the IETF meetings, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And these diplomats spent like 5 days talking to engineers and understanding better how the IETF works, but also explaining to the IETF folks how the UN works. I find this actually not only we have a bidirectional, if I may say that, or we educate, but we also get educated. Many people at ICANN 5 years ago didn't know why is the engagement with the UN at all. Now they do. Many people at the UN didn't quite understand what's the engagement going to why is this engagement taking place. Now they do. So it's a mutually beneficial process, and I'm very happy that we have this process, and I think it will be expanded further. I think there was, Timo, to use this, there was another question to you from Mike Nelson. If you're on the phone, I can read it for you.
Before you do that, there was a question, and Veni, you were actually addressing this, but I'll actually just raise that particular question, and then if we can go to Mike's question that he was directing specifically at Timo. What the question is, it really just is, do you want to develop any further thoughts on this? The question is, why is the IGF not being used more effectively by governments and others involved in the GGE? And in other words,
that's a question for Timo, I think, not for me.
Okay, I was, yeah, you don't want to lobby. I would, okay.
Well, no, the GGE is, you know, governmental group of experts. I'm not a member.
Okay. Okay. Ambassador, would you take really those two questions? One is that why is it not being used more effectively? And then the second is a classic Mike Nelson question. Mike is a lovely guy, which is, and I'll share this with you if you can't see it. Do you have examples of dangerous ideas and mindsets being discussed in the hallways of New York, or the hallways of the United Nations, actually, besides what the Russians are doing?
Yeah, so the first one on the IGF, I know there is a push to indeed use the IGF for discussions of these kind, and even a reform of the IGF. I must say I'm not an expert on that in that area. We work with a forum that is offered to us. The UN is certainly not ideal. Multilateral processes by definition are not ideal. They're very slow and cumbersome and complicated, etc. But I know that certainly Germany, of course, is thinking how to reform the IGF in a way that it can be utilized for these kind of discussions in the future. Dangerous ideas and mindsets. I think it's and I don't mean to pick on the Russians, but we talked about inclusivity and multi-stakeholderism, and I found a certain inconsistency in the Russian position, where if you first push, if the narrative about an open-ended working group is that it's more inclusive and etc., then why prevent certain participants and stakeholders from participating? I think in general, what I would say is a dangerous trend is that we think that we can actually start from scratch, that we believe that we can throw away whatever we have as the international rules-based order and renegotiate something new. In some ways, I understand why that is sometimes put forward, these kind of ideas, because the existing deal might not be the greatest deal that is available. But, and let me be honest, the United States over the past years have stepped out of a number of multinational and multilateral agreements that I think leaves us in a difficult position. As a professional diplomat, I would like to see the international rules-based order, which we have built since the Second World War, to stay in place, even though it's not ideal, even though we would like to improve on some of those instruments. To step out and throw it away and then see if we can replace it with something else is, I think, not the right way forward. So let's go back to the area of cyber. There's a cyber crime treaty, which is called the Budapest Convention. It's initially a treaty that was created by the Council of Europe. So in other words, created by a group of European nations, well, that's enlarged Europe. But ever since it was conceived, it is now open for other nations to actually join and to sign and to follow the treaty and to exchange information under the treaty, etc. So you will now see African countries acceding to the Budapest Convention, Asian countries, etc. Again, Russia, and supported by a large number of countries, by the way, say, well, we don't want to sign on the dotted line of an instrument that we could not negotiate from the start. So let's start afresh with a new cybercrime treaty. Same argument as I used before. That means two things. That means that you throw away the existing instrument. And secondly, that you have a long void, a vacuum in which you have nothing else that replaces it, because any kind of negotiation of these kinds would take a decade or more. So my plea, that's not just personal, but I think it's our Dutch position, that we would like to stick with the international rules-based order that we put in place, to utilize and improve on the instruments that we have, but not just throw away and see if we can start from scratch with something new.
You want to take on Mike's, amplify any more on Mike's specific question, the dangerous ideas?
Well, this is one danger. I think this is one dangerous idea. I think the whole idea that you can, or the trend, it's not just a single idea, the trend that you can do away with what you don't like and then see if you can replace it with something else, or maybe live without it. And again, I'm not just picking on the Russians, I'm also picking on the United States, because there is a trend from the United States to leave international commitments and treaties. Very recently, the Open Skies Treaty, only a couple of weeks ago, the INF Treaty, etc. This is a bit outside the cyber realm, but it's the trend in itself is I think a dangerous example, and I would like to in the cyber domain stick to the instruments we have, and perhaps improve on them or elaborate them, but not throw them away and then see what happens. By the way, if you follow me on Twitter, it's my handle is TSKOS, TSKOS. You will see a lot of statements that I always make about the international rules-based order. It's a sort of a hobby horse of mine.
Andy, we're about to finish, but I just saw that there was a question by another question which is in the chat. Unfortunately, I just saw it. How does the work at UN in New York relate to work at ITU in Geneva and UNODC in Vienna? So we do work, I mean, we have colleagues in Geneva, and we do follow the ITU. ICANN is a sector member of the development sector, and we work with them and follow what's happening there. So we are trying to coordinate all the efforts and to make sure that we bring the expertise to whichever organization needs it.
Thank you. We are, excuse me, we're running up on the hour right now, and I had promised our two great panelists that I would be very religious about the clock. I would honor, and I actually saw that Cheryl was on, and he's running into midnight right now, so I know it's late in Asia. But we really do thank the IIC from the bottom of our heart. They are two very, very good speakers. I think it was a lively discussion. It was good that we overcame the audio complexities at the very beginning. I do thank all the members of the IIC that are on the call. I thank you for being members. Those that aren't, please consider joining. We're a wonderful organization. Only purpose is to raise the conversations, to get the discussion going, and to get the thought processes moving. So with that, I thank you very, very much, and look forward to seeing you in the very near future.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thanks for participating.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Veni.